Okay, to discuss this, let's go to our panel now. Joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Lawrence Korb. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense and now a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. In Moscow, we have former Russian diplomat Viacheslav Matuzov. And with me here in the studio is TRT World defense analyst Oubai Shahbandar. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Larry Korb, let me start with you. Is Donald Trump right when he talks about NATO and he says that the U.S. is the world's piggy bank and that NATO countries, other NATO countries, aren't paying their fair share?
Well, he's not the first president or Secretary of Defense to say that NATO ought to spend more. But we're really not the piggy bank. What we need to do is increase NATO's capacity overall. If they spend more, it doesn't mean we'll spend less. Basically, it means that the alliance will be more capable.
Right. But Larry, do you agree that even though, for example, President Obama said everybody's got to chip in, that was far more subdued, and he wasn't a president that was actively extricating the United States from all sorts of agreements, right? So we look at Trump's track record, Paris Climate Accord, TPP, the Iran deal, and we fold this into that, and we look at the pattern and we think, okay, he's saying harsh stuff about NATO, maybe the US is going to pull out. Is that fair?
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that under him, as compared to, say, President Obama or President Bush, this could happen. I don't think it will, because members of his national security team, even John Bolton, who's the hardliner, don't want us to pull out of NATO, particularly at this time when the Russians are becoming much more aggressive.
Viacheslav Matuzov, cracks in the NATO alliance, Vladimir Putin must be celebrating.
No, I don't think so, that Putin is celebrating in weakening Europe. On the contrary, I think that Putin is interested in keeping Europe and a counterpartner as a strong and economically and politically, because it is balancing Russian foreign policy vis-à-vis the United States, vis-à-vis the Chinese direction, and so I don't think that we are very happy if European Union will be dissolved. That's why my opinion is that in this precious point, Russia doesn't internally agree with Donald Trump's efforts to dissolve European Union as a part of the world policy that is not going on his line.
Right, but I mean, Russia.
So I think
sorry to interrupt you. Right, Russia is seen as a threat. One of the reasons why a lot of the NATO member states are not happy with Donald Trump diminishing NATO's role or diminishing the U.S. role within NATO is because they believe, when you look at Ukraine and when you look at the Baltics, they believe that Russia is an active threat and they need more U.S. help and they need the U.S. to step up now because Russia is deciding to be more expansionist. Do you disagree with that?
No, I can't agree, because if we look attentively to reasons why coup d'etat was happened in Kiev, in Ukraine, in 14, because of American policy, not European policy. Europeans came to Kiev to save the situation. But first of all, to destroy that time Ukrainian government came John McCain. Then foreign ministry activists.
Right.
And many other people who are connected with the United States.
Right. Yeah.
And our opinion is that Ukraine is the result of American policy, not of European.
Yeah, you feel the West has been provoking you rather than the other way around. Let me ask you, Oubai, is it easy to tell whether Trump gets NATO or gets its value? Or does he get it and he just doesn't believe that the U.S. should be contributing that much while others don't?
Well, I think there's no question that President Trump, at least himself, and has told advisors, according to reports that we've seen, that he believes that the U.S. is paying too much for NATO and not seeing enough return and enough investment from other NATO country members. For instance, President Trump has sent letters to both Norway, Germany, and other NATO countries asking them to meet their pledge of spending up to 2% of their GDP for military spending. Currently, only 4 countries in NATO, the US, UK, Estonia, and Greece, meet that pledge of 2% spending their GDP for military spending. Poland is close at 1.99%. But there's a sense of frustration in Washington that we're seeing by this administration that we've seen from prior administration, both Republican and Democrats. But this time around, President Trump seems to be really putting his foot down, telling NATO countries, hey, you have to pay up, or the U.S. may move its military presence in Europe elsewhere. And I think European countries, NATO members, really should take that warning close to heart.
Larry Korb, Germany spending 1.5% of its GDP, going up to 2025 as far as I understand. So does Trump have a point? Here you have big old Germany, which is committed to NATO. Trump's making noise. Germany's not paying as much as the United States. Why doesn't it chip in?
Well, there's no doubt about the fact. NATO, basically the whole, the member nations all agreed that by 2024, they would go to 2% of the GDP. And Germany says that they will not. So I think it's right to say you ought to do that. But the idea that if you don't do that, we're going to cut back makes no sense, because we're not there just to protect the Europeans. It's to protect our national interest. And it's very, very important that we maintain our presence there. In fact, if we brought the troops home, it would actually cost us more money unless we got rid of the troops. And Trump is actually adding people to the armed forces this year. So basically, it's making a point, but it's basically not making it in a way that makes a great deal of sense. And I think other than Germany, by 2024, all the other nations will hit that target.
Right. Larry Korb, perhaps, besides the fact that he believes that the U.S. is paying a disproportionate amount vis-a-vis the others, right? Do you think it's plausible that he actually doesn't see the Russian threat as serious as the other countries do?
Yeah, I think that is a danger. I mean, he's basically said, well, it was okay for them to take Ukraine, take Crimea. They all speak Russian. No, I think if you go back and you take a look, Georgia, Ukraine, you take a look at the exercises they're running in the Baltics. Russia is becoming more aggressive, and there's no doubt about the fact. In fact, our Senate Intelligence Committee just concluded yesterday they did attempt to interfere in our election to help Trump and hurt Secretary Clinton.
Okay, Viacheslav Matuzov, Russia is becoming more aggressive, which is why NATO needs to be stronger.
Well, I don't agree with Russia. The situation in Russia is more aggressive. On the contrary, Russia in defense position. Russia react on American policy. Look at 2008, August 8. It is American or Georgian military exercises ended, and immediately Georgian army was offensive to a Russian military position in South Ossetia. It is not Russia provocated. It is, and behind Georgian army was American and Israeli specialists who pushed the Georgian army to invade South Ossetia. Failed.
Okay.
And let's see on Ukraine, the same.
Okay, fair enough. And you mentioned Ukraine. Certainly. Okay.
Nazis.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Larry Korb.
So we've had the example. Crimea is a result of the American policy.
Okay, you
not
say it's
Russian
a result.
Aspiration.
Okay, but certainly, it's considered internationally annexed by Russia and not recognized internationally. Larry Korb, let me ask you. We're hearing the Russian perspective on issues such as Ukraine, issues such as Georgia. They consider themselves in a defensive position vis-a-vis NATO. And when we look at the NATO exercises, particularly in the Baltics, do you accept that maybe the Russians have a right to feel provoked because NATO is more powerful than they are?
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that the Russians are not as militarily powerful as they were during the Cold War, but they're much more powerful than they were back in the 90s. They're spending about 2.5% of their GDP on defense. And if you take a look at the Baltics, they conquered the Baltics and took them over until the end of the Cold War. And the Baltics asked to join NATO. This was not our idea. They wanted to do that. And we had no American troops in South Ossetia. That's nonsense. We had no troops in Ukraine. What happened is Ukraine and Georgia wanted to join not just NATO, but the European Union. And the people in Ukraine rose up to get rid of a Russian-supported dictator who who went to Russia after the people asked him to leave.
As we kind of circle back to the beginning, will Trump leave NATO? He's giving indications that he might want to, but is it plausible? And if he does, what would that mean?
Well, it seems that President Trump's moves are actually counterintuitive to what many people accuse him of being pro-Russia. If you look at the letter that he sent to Norway, he actually refers to Norway as the northern flank against Russia, right? So that's what NATO is. NATO is a collective European defense institution, essentially not geared initially against the Soviet Union, and now a collective defense against potential Russian aggression. And there's a recognition by the Trump administration that the reason why these NATO countries need to increase their GDP spending for their military is to strengthen that collective European defense against potential Russian aggression. And secondly, it's also interesting from an energy security standpoint what the Trump administration has been doing. They've been pressuring the Germans not to support the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline with the Russians, which Washington believes will increase Russia's stranglehold over the energy security of Europe. So on multiple fronts, both on the military side and on the energy security side, the Trump administration is actually pushing against Russian strength in Europe and Russian attempts at hegemony in Europe, actually pretty strongly. So we got to give them credit where credit is due.
Okay, so Larry Korb, the Trump administration does get it, and they do see Russia as a threat, and they're working towards that. But NATO is about spending. It's not about seeing the Russian threat as diminished, according to Oubai. What do you think?
Well, no, it's increasing. Russia is, as I say, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the Russian military was not in good shape, but they're beginning to make it much more capable. We see what their aircraft have done in Syria. They're very, very sophisticated. You also see Putin, and he gave a speech right before the election talking about modernizing, his nuclear forces, talked about a hypersonic missile. So they are becoming more formidable. And I think that's what Trump is making the point. And I agree, NATO needs to do more. But the idea that somehow if you don't meet 2% of GDP, we're going to get out. Trump, you may remember, once time said that Article 5 wasn't that important. The other thing to keep in mind is NATO helped us in Afghanistan after the attacks of 9/11. So it's not just an anti-Russian alliance. It's something that can accomplish a lot around the world.
Yeah, and Larry Korb, let me ask you about what you think of what James Melville Jr. said, the American ambassador to Estonia, as he resigned. He put this in a Facebook post. He said, for the president to say the EU was set to take advantage or set up to take advantage of the United States to attack our piggy bank, or that NATO is as bad as NAFTA, is not only factually wrong, but proves to me that it's time to go. So that was a mic drop moment as he exited. What does that tell you about the White House versus the State Department, or the White House versus the ambassadors who are on the front lines?
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that President Trump is trying to undermine what we call the liberal international order, or something that's existed really since the end of World War II. And, he's cut the State Department, budget back substantially. We don't have enough diplomats. We don't have ambassadors in many countries. And he's confusing the EU with NATO. The EU has nothing to do with NATO. The European Union is an economic thing that was actually started by the French and the Germans in the Treaty of Rome that said Europe, given its size and what's happening in the world, would do much better if they had a common currency, they didn't have borders, and they had free and open trade. That's not a threat to the United States. In fact, it's something that helps the United States. So again, I think, Trump is mixing up an awful lot of things. Just because a country doesn't spend 2% of its GDP on defense doesn't mean that they're undermining the European Union, or the European Union is undermining us. You saw what happened when he put the tariffs on the European Union. Harley Davidson left the United States to make their equipment over in Germany. That's not going to help us.
Vyacheslav Matuzov, is it in Russia's interests for NATO to break apart?
Well, Russia cannot support NATO, the existence, because Warsaw camp that was existing was dissolved. And now NATO, it is old-fashioned structure, of course. Russia not supporting the idea of keeping NATO on floating. But we remember very well that the key country in NATO is the United States Army. And that's why not any other army are dangerous for Russia. How many atomic bombs located in Germany? American atomic heads. So I think that American policy, America as a leading country in NATO, that is, to tell frankly, is the main danger. If they are talking about the NATO organization, NATO is strengthening, it's nothing for us. Because the main rivalry for Russian military are American army, not European. That's why I think that the subject of Putin and Trump discussion in Finland will be the main issue as they settled right now. It is rockets of middle and short range action. And I think it is America went out of this agreement. Russia now maybe returned back with the United States. I think that a strategic weapon, strategic balance is the main issue that bothering Russian military and political heads here in Moscow.
Okay.
And besides that, Middle East, of course,
right,
as a point where both sides can be met.
And they seem to be more in agreement with it.
Collapse.
Certainly. They seem to be more in agreement in a place like Syria than they have been in a long, long time. Lots of questions, very few answers. But for the moment, Trump is throwing things out there and we're trying to understand it. And I've enjoyed trying to unpack it with all of you. Oubai Shahbandar, Viacheslav Matuzov and Lawrence Korb. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers.